Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to part 2 of my deck declutter series. I want to talk a little bit about my deck culling process. So I had originally intended and did set out to actually record my whole process of culling my collection. What ended up happening was that when I turned the camera on, I became way more aware of the quality of my film, the audio, things of that nature. I was focusing more on the actual act of recording the culling than actually focusing on the culling itself. So that meant that I wasn't really paying as much attention to the decks as I really wanted to, because I needed this to be an actual productive, mindful process that I was going through. And while getting great video is fantastic, the main point was to actually kind of cull and pare down my collection into something that was a little bit more manageable for me. So I turned off the camera, and then I spent the next couple of days going through every single deck I owned. So during this whole process, what I ended up doing was making a list of key questions that I wanted to ask myself for every deck. Well, let me rephrase that. There are a couple of decks in my collection, say for example, my Llewellyn Tarot. I don't even need to think about that one. That one's an automatic yes. So there are a couple of decks in my collection, a handful or so, that will always be in my collection. And I really didn't need to ask myself any questions about them because I knew they were always going to be with me. So those went straight to the keep pile. But for the rest of the decks, even if it was a deck that I was pretty sure that I was going to keep, I still asked myself these key kind of culling questions that I'd come up with. So even though I can't actually share the process of taking a look at each deck and going, do I want to keep this one or do I want to pass it along? Honestly, that would probably be pretty boring after a while anyway, because I think I had somewhere around 300 decks when we started this. So I thought instead I'll just kind of share with you my process in case this is something that you're looking at doing as well. So the first thing I did was to actually come up with the question. So I had these great big piles of decks all over my floor, right? And I was looking at them and going, how am I ever going to determine what I want to keep and what I want to get rid of? Like, that's a lot of decks. And again, trying to record that made the whole process super overwhelming. So instead, what I did was I sat down and really thought about what I want my collection to be. What's its purpose? For me, it's to support my tarot readings, to support my personal growth practice and my spiritual practice. That's the main goal for my entire collection. I don't read professionally and I don't read for other people, so every deck in my collection is meant for me. So that means that I need to resonate with it on some personal level, right? It needs to have some sort of personal significance or meaning for me. Now, if I were reading professionally, my criteria would be totally different when I was determining which decks that I wanted to keep or get rid of. I would probably have two piles, right? A pile of decks that I felt were really suited to client readings and a pile of decks that I felt were just for me personally. But that's not my situation, and I'm guessing for the majority of you, it isn't yours either. So what I did first and foremost was to really get clear about what the purpose was of having all of these decks in my collection. I do like the variety. I like being able to pick and choose my decks to kind of match them to, as we know, a season or a particular theme or particular mood that I'm in. So I do like having variety in that sense. But one of the things that I was becoming very mindful of was that I don't really care for super repetitive energies across a broad spectrum of decks. And I found that that was definitely the case for me. So I had to get really clear about what I wanted my collection to be and what its purpose was overall. So once I kind of got really clear about that, I did do some journaling about it, did do some kind of deep thinking about, why do I have all these decks? I mean, some of them I have just because, it was pretty and I bought it. And some of them I have because they've been sent to me for review. And some of them I have because so-and-so recommended it, which is all great. But at the end of the day, they all need to serve my personal practice because that's why they're here. That's why I have them. So first and foremost, getting really clear about my process, I think was really key for me. The next thing that I did was to sit down and kind of think up some questions that I wanted to ask myself about each deck. So these were questions designed to help me kind of uncover that personal connection, to really look at where I use this deck and how I use this deck in my collection, and ultimately what purpose does it serve. So the 5 key questions that I came up with are, one is, what is this deck's place in my collection? So basically, what purpose does it serve? Why do I have it? And the second question is, how often do I use it? Because I have a lot of decks, and so sometimes I do only rotate them out seasonally. So there are decks that maybe I only use a couple times a year. And that's fine with me because I do have certain decks that relate to certain seasons for me. What's not okay is if I bring a deck in, I use it once and never touch it again. So that was really more what I was looking for. When asking myself the question of how often do I use it, I'm not really looking for a magical number, like I have to use a deck, a dozen times before it becomes a permanent part of my collection. Really what it is how long have I had it and how much have I used it since then? So is it a deck that I used once and then put on the shelf and haven't touched it for a year? Or is it a deck that I do maybe only use a couple times a year, but I do consistently use it at that same time every year or for those same particular readings? For me, that's totally okay. I just don't want to have decks that I use once, throw on my shelf, and never touch again. So that's really what I was looking for when I was asking myself, how often do I use it? There wasn't a magical number. It was more of a feeling of, is this a deck that I really feel like I'm going to use again? Or is it a deck that it was a one and done for me? The third question, and probably the most important question in this whole process for me, is, do I have anything else that serves that same purpose? Because when I was going through my decks, I found that I had a lot of decks that had really overlapping energies or purposes or intentions for me in my collection. So like, for example, if I bought a goddess deck, I already have several goddess decks. So what is this deck's purpose in my collection? Is it to complement these other goddess decks? Is it bring something different to the table? Say like, for example, the Goddess Temple Oracle. That's a goddess deck, but it does have its own structure and it is different from, say, the Sacred Mothers and Goddesses. So both of those decks, while they are both primarily goddess decks, both serve a different purpose for me in my collection. And so even though there's kind of overlapping energies and occasionally we do get even overlapping cards, they don't quite serve the same exact purpose in my collection. Now, that's not to say that I don't keep decks that do serve the same exact purpose in my collection, because some of them have a different feeling or different energy to them. So that was the real key question, was, do I have other things in my collection that serve that purpose, and are they just competing with each other, or do they individually complement different aspects of my practice? So that was definitely a key thing I was looking for. The other 2 questions that I asked myself were kind of, I don't want to say after the fact questions, but kind of if I got through that whole first 3, those big 3 key questions, then I kind of looked at, would I buy this deck again? So if I didn't have it now, is it a deck that I would buy again? And the other question is, can I replace it or can I buy it again? Because some of the decks in my collection, like, they're out of print or they're maybe really limited indie edition runs. And so while maybe it's a deck that I like and I would buy again, I may not have access to buy it again. So that is a consideration in some of the decks that I was passing along. There was one deck in particular that I was really going back and forth about because it is out of print and it is really expensive if you want to replace it, and it's not easy to come by. So I had to really think about that one, because when it got to the point of it doesn't have a place in my collection, I've never used it, I have many things that serve that same purpose, so it doesn't really have a place in my collection. But when it came down to those last 2 questions of, would I buy it again and can I buy it again? The answer was pretty much no on both counts. I wouldn't buy it again, and I can't replace it, or at least not easily. So it's that one sticking point that I was like, I can't replace it. So if I get rid of it, it's probably gone and I'm probably never going to have it again. So I need to be really sure that that's a decision that's okay with me. For that particular deck, it was okay because it's just not something that I have used or am ever going to use. So even though it's a deck that I'm probably not going to be able to replace if I change my mind, I feel pretty confident about the decision I've made because all of those other questions that I've asked myself, I was really sure about those answers. So those were kind of the key elements that I used when really going through my decks. Those 5 key questions, I kind of just went down the list with everyone. It wasn't anything that I journaled about. I just kind of, sat there, I looked through the cards, and I kind of, in my own mind answered those questions. And I think it's also key to look through the cards when you're doing this, because sometimes I found if I just picked up a deck and I just looked at the box, there may not be any sort of connection there to the box, right? I had to open it up and I had to get into the cards. But when I actually got my hands on the cards and I started looking through them, I'd be like, oh, okay, this one really does connect on this level for me, or I do use this one all the time with this particular deck, or, whatever the case may be. So I did go through all of my decks and I did go through them actually looking at the cards. Maybe not the whole deck for all of my tarots, but I definitely looked through enough to give me a sense and an understanding and just allow me some time to really sit with the deck and to look at it and to kind of work through those key questions that I had for myself. So it was a really great process. It was a very time-consuming process, but I found that kind of when I turned the camera off, I didn't feel quite the pressure or the time constraints that I had if I were trying to actually record that whole process. So while I had the best of intentions where that was concerned, it just didn't end up working out or being something that I could actually do and make this process be something that was actually productive and meaningful for me. And that was really the point, because while I do really enjoy sharing my journey with you all, I do need to make sure that I'm still being authentic to my own self and my own practice. So hopefully in all of that, you might find some ideas or some inspirations to help you if you're looking at maybe culling your own collection. I think that whether or not we're even kind of culling our collection, I think it's a good idea to occasionally just go through and look at your decks and maybe ask yourself, what's its purpose? Why do I have it? What do I use it for? Just to kind of refresh you on the decks that you do have, what you're using them for. And you may find that you do have some decks that have overlapping energies, or decks that you maybe thought would work out for you and didn't, or decks that you used once and put on the shelf. Guilty of that one. So I thought that this might be helpful for somebody else. So before we actually look at the decks that are leaving my collection, I wanted to just take a moment to really talk a little bit about how the whole process went for me, especially because I didn't get the video I had intended to get, but the process did go a lot smoother and it was a lot more meaningful for me, not worrying about the camera and just focusing on the decks and the questions that I was asking myself. Thank you for joining me today. You'll find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.